Good evening, everybody. It's great to be here. My name is Rich Belfus. I'm the president and CEO of the International Crane Foundation, and I've been a friend and colleague of the speaker tonight for 38 years, believe it or not. But a couple of years ago, we celebrated our 50th anniversary at the Crane Foundation, and 52 years ago, George, together with his friend Ron Saway, had the idea to start this global foundation for the conservation of cranes. And here we are still at it. And I think it would have been hard to believe 52 years ago that we would have offices all over Africa and Asia and down here in Texas. We have partners in 50, 60 countries worldwide. We call ourselves the Grand Global Network of Craniacs. And it's a remarkable thing, really. And George has won almost every conservation award there is out there, but what I've always admired about George, really since I met him in 1987, is his ability to inspire people to work for these birds and work for the lands that the birds need. I know George has probably written like 10,000 letters to people overseas, and that's probably an underestimate. People, because now with email, he sends them out at 2 a.m. every day. But I think he's sent out letters to every high school kid who writes and asks about some question about cranes. Anybody in any country who's interested in conservation takes the time to jot a little note. And I think that's the thing I've most admired about George all these years is his willingness to do this and his dedication to these birds and to anybody who's willing to help them out. It's a great tribute, I think, in addition to everything else. So who fought the weather today to see a whooping crane? Did anybody? Some people got out. It was a tough day for crane watching. We were out at this new property we're hoping to get down here, wonderful new property on the coast to help do conservation for whooping cranes. And we had 2 cranes fly over, so it was an auspicious day for us. And I'm looking forward now to hearing George. It's probably the maybe 100 or 200th time I've heard George speak, but it's always good and it's always inspiring. And it's a great pleasure, George, to introduce you. So this is Dr. George Archibald, co-founder of the International Crane Foundation.
Well, there are 2 kinds of cranes, whooping cranes, migratory ones and non-migratory ones. And how many of you are non-migratory people that live down here? Put your hand up. How many are migratory? It's sort of like that with the cranes too. There aren't very many non-migratory ones. There are a lot more migratory ones. Well, we love to come to Texas, and we just came from Houston, and look at these wonderful people that gathered at the Houston Zoo from many parts of the conservation community in Texas. And I want to thank Port Aransas for hosting us every year. I think this is our 28th year for the Crane Festival. And I've seen a lot of changes in your community, so much construction, of course, after Harvey, all the rebuilding and so on. And I especially want to thank so many special people like those in this picture for taking us under your wing, literally. Thank you so much. We love coming here. And this year, Joan, we want to thank you especially for stepping in and filling the gap and making it all happen. Rich and I just came from Korea. We had our first board of directors meeting overseas in Korea. So I want to show you a few slides from the Orient. This is the beautiful red-crowned crane, and this pair is going to show you how to dance. Cranes are famous for their dancing. This is a family of cranes. The juvenile is wondering what mom and dad are up to. But I don't know why these cranes are dancing. They've had a lot of food. My friends feed them. My friends, Mr. and Mrs. Nakamoto, live in the countryside in Hokkaido, Japan, and they have a pair of cranes on either side of the road. The road is the demilitarized zone, and there are little ponds that they have fish, and they feed the cranes. They come every day. And so I always visit Mr. and Mrs. Nakamoto and hear the latest news about their cranes. Who died, who got divorced, who was successful raising a chick or two chicks. And I was there with a bunch of friends, and we were leaving, and I said, I think I'll just go over and say goodbye to the cranes. So a couple of friends of mine went with me, and just standing there by the road, and I took this picture with my cell phone. Isn't that amazing? And they just started dancing and disappeared. Well, that's in northern Japan, the most northern island of Japan, called Hokkaido. And they're the non-migratory red-crowned cranes, but on the mainland, we have the larger population of red-crowned cranes that migrates. And the map on the left shows the range of these birds maybe 20 years ago. You can see a lot of birds are wintering in North Korea. Now there's not a single crane wintering in North Korea as far as we know. And likely there were some thousands of them wintering in China, and they hit a huge range in northern China. There are huge wetlands up there. The Korean War ended in 1953. There were tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers fighting against the United Nations force and the South Koreans. And after the war ended, they were not allowed to go back home. They were told to go to northern China to work on creating China's great northern food basket. And they had to dig dikes and channels through the wetlands and drain them. And most of the wetlands, about 90% or more of the wetlands were drained. And you can see the crane population is only found in a few widespread areas in China. And the numbers wintering in China have dropped to 500 or 600 birds. The more eastern ones that we think nest mostly in Russia are coming down into the Korean peninsula. And this is the demilitarized zone. It's about 3 miles wide. The hills in the distance in that village with the huge flagpole are in North Korea. And this village, called Taesongdong, is in South Korea. It's an accidental bird sanctuary. I worked a lot in Korea during the 1970s. When I started work there, my Korean colleagues told me there are no cranes left. They were all killed during the war. And we started working together, working in these remote areas along the DMZ. And in this one valley in the Central Highlands, where the heaviest fighting happened during the Korean War, it's called the Chorwon Basin. It's about 10 miles wide, offering a great opportunity for tank warfare. We found 125 red-crowned cranes and just 3 white-naped cranes. It was a wonderful discovery. We were terribly excited about the whole thing. This photograph was taken back in 1977. That hill is called Ice Cream Hill. It used to have lots of condors, tours, and forests, but there was so much artillery hit it, it formed into a cone. And thousands of people were killed during the final battles of the Korean War in 1953. And I climbed up to the top of that hill looking for the cranes. And I looked out in the distance. You can see it's not developed. That's the core part of the DMZ, about 3 miles wide. But you can see they're making rice paddies there. They were just starting to clear out the landmines and plant rice. And at the base of this hill, while forming a rice field, they discovered thousands of skeletons, a mass burial. And it was a very humbling experience to stand there in that quiet winter morning and see the cranes, discover the cranes, and think about the agony that so many people had at that scene. This is what it looks like today in the spring and the winter. It's all rice fields. They've removed the landmines, and right up to the edge of the DMZ, which of course they can't go into, they have planted crops of rice. In the winter, it's frozen. There's lots of waste rice. And the magic for birds is that the farmers aren't allowed in there in the winter. They have to be out by the 1st of November, and they can come back in March. So the people leave, there's lots of food, and in come the cranes. So this winter, we have about 2,700 red-crowned cranes, the big white ones, wintering in the DMZ, and up to 12,000 white-naped cranes using the area. Okay, look at the greenhouses. The government gave them permission to put up greenhouses on these rice paddies. The black ones are for mushrooms. The other ones are for flowers and vegetables. And the farmers can make 10 times as much money rather than planting rice. So this is a big threat to the welfare of the cranes. And it's something that the Crane Foundation is working on. How do we save this farmland? Should there be a war, of course, we would lose most of our cranes. If there's peace, they want to make these lowlands in the DMZ into reunification city. And of course, the challenge is now, can we permanently protect some of that farmland so that it will always be available for the cranes? So we're looking out towards North Korea, and on this reservoir, the cranes are roosting at night. Thousands of white-naped cranes and hundreds of red-crowned cranes at this location. And here is our board of directors. There were 36 people went over for our meeting, and we were joined by colleagues from Africa and Asia, and of course, lots of Koreans, and we had a wonderful time talking about the DMZ, the civilian controlled zone where all the farmers are, etc. So much for Asia. Tonight, we're talking about the whooping cranes. And I'm very grateful to Patricia Wright. Is she here tonight? For this beautiful photograph. She lives up in Rockport and took these pictures of the whooping cranes dancing. Their dance isn't quite as fancy as that of the red-crowned crane because they lack that beautiful arch display. But the whooping cranes are very special. They have black outer wing feathers like snow geese. That gives the feather greater strength. And their inner wing feathers, called tertials, can be elevated and lowered, and they elevate them when they're displaying. They have very, very demonstrative displays. This is a charge threat display, ending with this butterfly position. They walk around for a few seconds with their wings stiffly held behind. And here they are doing what we call a unison call. Now, cranes are monogamous. They breed very slowly. You can see the juvenile whooping crane between its parents. And during the duet, which is a territorial threat as well as a sexual display, the voice of the male and female is completely different. Now I'm going to play you a unison call, but I'm going to do an English version, which will help you hear it. doo, 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 and the doo doo is the female. So the female gives 2 calls for each call of the male. Here they go. Did you get it? If you didn't get it, listen carefully to this one. This is just after Harvey. I came down in December, and the duck blinds had all blown away. There were very few boats on the water. It was silent out there, except for the calls of the whooping cranes. Now, when the cranes are in the refuge here, they eat wolfberries, but they also eat a lot of crabs and fish, snakes, animal food. And they're very territorial. Sometimes several hundreds of acres will be their territory, and they drive away other cranes. You see, the juvenile is sort of following mom and dad, and they have their inner wing feathers elevated, and the neighbors have come too close, and they are strutting over towards their neighbors to tell them to get back. And here they go, flying. There's the butterfly threat display, and the wings open, and there are now they're doing the call. You can't hear it on the video. Butterfly threat again. The neighbors are walking away, not very happy. Another butterfly threat. Keep them going. Okay, they're the enemy. And back they come. And they're having a big fight. Now, this can be extremely serious. We have incidents with other species having birds killed in such conflict. They have extremely powerful beaks. They can knock a blue crab apart. And they, of course, have very delicate bodies and could injure each other. And that's why they have evolved these unison calls and threat displays to minimize contact. But if push comes to shove, they have a little fight, and off they go. Well, the whooping crane used to be found in the tallgrass prairie in the heart of the continent, from the Midwest up through Saskatchewan and Alberta. But when the Europeans came into this continent, they poured into the prairies, plowed them under, shot the wildlife. There were no stores. They had to live off the land. And the wildlife disappeared. The bison, the elk, the antelope, the trumpeter swans, and the whooping cranes and the sandhill cranes. The blue areas indicate the historic wintering sites of the whooping cranes. And a small flock survived, which decreased to about 16 birds in 1941. And they wintered down here near Port Aransas. Today it's called the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge, just across the water here, stretching along the coast. And slowly, through the efforts of a wonderful researcher with the National Audubon Society named Robert Porter Allen, who studied the whooping cranes through the 1940s and promoted public education all along the flyway, the birds increased step by step. The breeding ground was found in 1954, way up in northern Canada in a place called Wood Buffalo National Park, 2,700 miles from Port Aransas. And they found that they lay only 2 eggs a year, but they only usually raise 1 chick. So a plan was devised to take one egg from some of the nests and bring them to Maryland to start a captive flock. That was back in 1966. Well, it was very successful. Today, there are about 150 whooping cranes in captivity at about 10 different centers, including the Dallas Zoo. And San Antonio Zoo has one pair of whooping cranes. At the Crane Foundation, we have, I think, 12 pairs of whooping cranes. And the New Orleans Zoo has some, and there are other places that also have the whooping cranes. And a member of our staff in Baraboo, Wisconsin, her name is Kim Boardman, she's the manager of the captive flock. They have to exchange birds, and some birds should breed more than others, and so on. And this is what we call a species bank. And it's very secure, genetically managed, with a lot of people working together. Our eggs aren't all in one basket, they're at the different centers. And from the captive birds and from more eggs collected from the wild birds, there have been 4 experiments to try to establish a new flock of whooping cranes within the original range of the birds or close to it. The first experiment began in 1975 out in Idaho at a place called Grays Lake National Wildlife Refuge, which is a huge wetland area with hundreds of sandhill cranes breeding there that migrate to New Mexico, to the Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge. They raised whooping cranes. They put the eggs of the whooping crane into the sandhill nest and took the sandhill crane eggs back to Patuxent for research. But these whooping cranes were sexually imprinted on sandhill cranes and never had any interest in pairing with other whooping cranes, which sort of limited their reproductive potential. So from 289 eggs placed in the sandhill nests between 75 and 1988, 84 birds fledged and there was no pairing. So the experiment was stopped. The second experiment was to try to reestablish a non-migratory flock. The whooping crane recovery team, 5 people from the States, 5 from Canada, that got together every year. They didn't want to do it in Louisiana, where the whooping cranes used to breed, because they were afraid it was too close to the Aransas birds and might lead them astray. So they selected Florida. But we needed a new way to get them into the wild. This is the International Crane Foundation's headquarters in Wisconsin. We have about 250 acres. In the distance, in the center of the photograph, is a road, and we have our public area out there where you can come and see all the species of cranes, all 15 species, in beautiful exhibits. And between that area and these buildings in front of you, we have restored prairie. This part of Wisconsin used to be prairie and oak savanna. And then the buildings in front of you, it's called Crane City. It's surrounded by a predator-proof fence. There are 4 streets and 61 sheds in which we keep breeding pairs of cranes, including most of our whooping cranes. They breed quite well in captivity. And a researcher named Dr. Rob Horwich in 1986 started an experiment to see if he could use costumed people with hand puppets to raise cranes, and could these birds be released into the wild, and would they be imprinted on whooping cranes? Well, we found that they were very easy to rear this way as long as you could stand the hot weather wearing this costume. And they would follow you just as wild cranes will follow their parents. Then we took those birds to Florida. The main producers at that time were the Crane Foundation and Patuxent. The other centers came on later. We'd build these very, very predator-proof but movable release pins. They were netted over, and we'd take the birds and let them have 2 to 3 weeks before we removed the nets and let them fly out. They paired up with other whooping cranes and started breeding. And let me see if I can get this to work. This is a young pair of cranes developing copulation. The female is not opening her wings properly. She must be a bit shy. And the male fell off. But finally, she gets her wings open properly, and he's struggling to stay up there. And eventually, they successfully breed. Now, in captivity, when we have to get the full screen. Anybody know how to do that? I'm not going to fool with it or I'll screw it up completely. In Florida, thank you so much. There we go. Great. No more fiddling with me. We had a lot of problems with the survival of the birds. They paired up, they bred, but male cranes will fly around in big circles, driving away other birds, other cranes, sandhill cranes, and whooping cranes. And the females are more sedentary, but a lot of the males in Florida flying around like that collided with power lines. So we had a high mortality of birds that were flying around. In addition, whooping cranes go flightless every second or third year. You see the bird on the left, the flight feathers have completely fallen out. They do this after they lay their eggs and while they're raising the chicks. The chicks, of course, are flightless too, but they're quite prone to predation if they're not in large wetlands. And they're white, they're very obvious, and there are a lot of predators in Florida, especially bobcats. They were the biggest problem, actually. So over those years, from 1993 to 2005, 289 birds were released. 10 chicks fledged in the wild during that period, but their mortality was so high that the experiment was discontinued. But we learned a lot about putting birds into a non-migratory setting. So the third experiment was started in 2001 in Wisconsin to start a migratory flock. Birds were raised in captivity at Patuxent and the Crane Foundation. And when they were very young, they were trained to follow ultralight aircraft by costume people. We worked with a wonderful organization out of Canada called Operation Migration. And they would come down with their ultralights and train these birds to follow them to Florida. It was a wonderful operation, and from 2001 till 2015, every year a flock of 10 to 15 birds were led from Wisconsin to Florida. They had radios and we could follow them very, very exactly. Most of them came back to central Wisconsin on their own. They spent the whole winter with a little help from the keepers. They would keep them in a fenced area way out in the wetland at night to protect them from predators. But in the spring, they would fly back to Wisconsin. They paired up together beautifully. The first pair nested in 2006. They had 2 young. One of the chicks disappeared just before fledging. But we had a real problem with black flies driving the cranes from their nest in late April. On the first warm day, when most of the whooping cranes were nesting, black flies hatched by the millions and would descend on the cranes and their eggs and drive the cranes from the nest. We moved our release area into an area where there were fewer black flies. Mike Forsberg is in the audience tonight. Where are you, Mike? Way back there. He's a real craniac. And he did a beautiful book. I hope you'll all get one. And he's going to be speaking tomorrow. But I wanted to salute Mike for all his hard work on the whooping cranes and to share with you some slides that he shared with me when he was observing a pair of whooping cranes in Wisconsin. And this pair of whooping cranes took over a marsh where there used to be a pair of sandhill cranes. And we thought the sandhill cranes had left that immediate area, but the sandhills were pretty smart. They went into a forested wetland area and nested and became totally silent so as to be undetected by the whooping cranes. And Mike was parked beside the road photographing the whooping cranes that also had a chick. And what should happen but the sandhill cranes walked out with their 2 little chicks. See the chicks there on the ground? Well, the whooping cranes' red is expanded. They are really mad. And of course, if they could, they would likely kill those chicks and drive away the sandhill cranes. So the female sandhill crane is on the right. She's got her head down and the male is puffing himself up. And things are getting extremely tense. The whooping cranes flick into the open wing back threat with their red expanded, their one leg elevated, and the sandhill crane has his red on his head expanded to the full extent. Suddenly, the whooping crane flew towards the male sandhill crane, and the bird avoided him. Then the female sandhill crane attacked the female whooping crane and scared her. She's given up her threat posture. She's trying to escape. And actually, I think the sandhill crane may have even touched her. So at the same time this was all going on, the male sandhill crane flew and the male whooping crane followed him. And the sandhill crane led that male away. And they were gone for about 20 minutes. And then the whooping crane came back. By that time, the female whooping crane had retreated. And the sandhill cranes were able to live peacefully with the whooping cranes ever after. The sandhill cranes actually fledged both of their chicks, but the whooping crane chick was taken by a predator just before it fledged. So we have 17 to 20 whooping crane pairs nesting in Wisconsin, but our big challenge is survival. Survival of the adults when they molt and survival of chicks when they're growing up. So we're continuing to work on trying to improve their survival. And they're quite clever. This pair has to cross a road to get to their favorite cornfield where they feed on earthworms and corn. And they stand carefully looking up and down the road for traffic and then take their little guy across the road. I was so concerned at first, we all were, that one of them would be killed or they'd all be killed. But so we're continuing to work on that experiment. The fourth experiment is to start a non-migratory flock in Louisiana. The recovery team now felt comfortable because when we started our releases in Florida, we found they didn't fly very far from the release area. They pretty much stayed in that south central area of Florida. So we thought if we release cranes in Louisiana, they too will remain in that area. So we could divide our area, formerly called the Cajun Prairie, into two places. The remaining wetlands, huge wetlands along the coast, where the last of the non-migratory whooping cranes were seen in 1939 with 2 chicks. And the area to the north, it used to be grasslands and wetlands. It extended west right to the Katy Prairie west of Houston. And there are records of whooping cranes actually breeding in Texas in that ecosystem. Looking at it from the sky, in the south, we have the natural wetlands, we have the Intercoastal Canal, and to the north, we have this enormous agricultural area. This is the gentleman, John Lynch, who studied the whooping cranes in the 1930s and 40s. And since 2010, we've been sending birds from the captive breeding centers to southwestern Louisiana to release in the natural wetlands, not in the agricultural area to the north. We can follow the birds very carefully, and this whole work is sponsored by the Louisiana Department of Fisheries and Wildlife. They have the researchers, and we are working on public education in that area. Most of the whooping cranes preferred crayfish ponds, lots of food, and build their nests there, and the farmers were very, very helpful. The staff worked with the farmers, told them all about the whooping cranes, and there was this harmony between humans and people. But unfortunately, our big challenge in Louisiana is embryonic death. A lot of the whooping crane eggs just don't hatch. They die during development. A lot of them do hatch, however, and we're hopeful that we can identify what the contaminant is, or if it's a bacteria or some other problem, but we have not solved that problem yet and continue to work on Louisiana. But we're hopeful that it eventually will be a self-sustaining flock of birds. So, you see, we had this dream that it would be really easy to start a new flock of whooping cranes somewhere and it would be self-sustaining. But we have 2 failed experiments, and we have 2 that are continuing. For the welfare of the whooping crane, we really have to keep concentrated on the flock that migrates from northern Canada to Texas. And I'm just going to talk about some of the threats that the whooping cranes are facing. In 2008 to 2011, there was a terrible drought here in Texas, and 22 whooping cranes died during those winters. Most of them were on the refuge because there wasn't enough rainfall. The Guadalupe River didn't have enough water to flood into these brackish ponds, creating the perfect environment for the blue crab, which was the major food of the whooping crane. Of course, water everywhere is such a challenge. As the human population requires more and more water, for example, there's not enough water now for all the rice farms around Houston. So a lot of them are being closed, and the water is dedicated to feeding the urban centers. And too much water is another problem. As the glaciers and so on are melting, the sea level is rising, and some of the wetlands now used by the whooping cranes may be too deep if the water continues to rise. And temperatures are increasing. Can you believe it based on what you experienced today? Anyway, this bush called the black mangrove is spreading north, and other woody vegetation now threatens the wetlands. If it gets very brushy with woody vegetation, the whooping cranes can't feed there in the wintertime. So that's another threat. Well, what about hurricanes? The second largest hurricane ever seen in this part of the world was Harvey in 2017. Of course, Katrina was even worse. And great damage, human life. There's the path, and it hit dead on to the Aransas Refuge and to Rockport. That's what the urban areas look like. And here's Liz Smith, who was our head of our office down there with the blue shirt on. And that's what's left of our office in Rockport. It was a devastating time for you people. And what about the cranes? Well, this was in August. The cranes were up in Wood Buffalo National Park breeding. I came down in December and was amazed that there were so many wolfberries out on the reserve, and there seemed to be a lot of blue crabs in the wetlands. The cranes were very happy. The surge of water apparently was 12 feet deep over the refuge that came inland during Harvey. And maybe this helped the wetland ecosystem. So the whooping cranes arrived, there was lots of food, and they did very well. But in the future, there are so many things changing with the climate. If we had a late hurricane, how would that impact our whooping cranes? Well, this is the Intercoastal Canal, which goes all the way from Brownsville over to St. Mark in Florida. We all know about it. And it comes right by here, and you have these barges pushing these boats filled with oil and chemicals and so on. And if there was an accident, the whooping cranes are roosting at night and feeding during the day, a lot of them right beside the Intercoastal Canal. So that's a huge risk to the population as well, should there be an accident. And in Wood Buffalo National Park, the nesting ground way up in Canada, there are patches of permafrost here and there. We don't understand exactly the distribution of it. There's a big study underway in Canada, but we know from work in Russia and Mongolia and China that in permafrost areas there, when the permafrost melts, the wetlands that are perched on top of the permafrost just disappear. They just go into the ground. So it remains to be seen how safe the breeding ground of the whooping crane is. Is it patchy? Are we going to lose some of the wetlands to permafrost lost? And we had a wonderful meeting in Calgary a few years ago, and we had Native Canadian people participate in the meeting. And they said, we have noticed that some of the wetlands are disappearing, and some of the areas that are forested are now very wet. So maybe the water is just leaving here and coming up over there. But it's an uncertainty, and we really don't know how secure the long-term future for the whooping cranes is in Wood Buffalo National Park. Now, if you're flying north like a whooping crane, like Mike Forsberg, he followed those birds north, and those are included in his beautiful book about the whooping crane, which I hope he will get. If the cranes look down and they see this forest of wind machines, they want to avoid that area. Now that's good. They're not going to run into one of the props. But apparently, through the studies of whooping cranes that are carrying radio transmitters, they stay about 5 miles away from a wind farm. So there could be very good wetlands in that area that they would use as resting areas and feeding areas during migration. And there are great wind energy resources in the Great Plains, very strong winds, and plans for more and more wind farms. So researchers are now trying to work with industry to make sure that there are safe places for the whooping cranes. And a hideous threat that's just happening in the world is avian influenza. It started in Asia, but it spread to North America. This is on the Platte River in Nebraska a few years ago, a flock of whooping cranes. The whooping cranes have increased to about 550 birds. And flocks like this can be seen in Saskatchewan and Nebraska during migration. And of course, there are hundreds of thousands of sandhill cranes in these enormous flocks that are migrating. And this year, some sandhill cranes have died in eastern North America from avian influenza. And we're very, very nervous about that. The Crane Foundation helps support retrieval of birds and measures that can be taken to minimize risk. Like, think about the demilitarized zone over in Korea. We have 90% of the world's white-naped cranes in those big flocks along the DMZ. In 2021, in Israel, 8,000 Eurasian cranes, a non-endangered species, but they died in Israel due to avian influenza. So we are very, very careful about this problem and concerned. Now, last spring, I was in Nebraska having my breakfast at the Crane Trust, and they had a big television screen there, and they had the video on this pair of whooping cranes. They did a dance. Now let me see if I can get. Now you have to compare their dance to that of the red-crowned crane, which my program started with. Okay. And they're dancing on ice. Have you tried dancing on ice? Whoops. And off they go. This is Carter Cooch, who's the head of our Texas office. And here he is with the ICF staff. The 4 of them are part of our team here in Texas and 2 in Louisiana. They're doing great things to make sure the habitat is going to be good for the whooping cranes and that people will care for the whooping cranes. Public education is our big emphasis in Louisiana. We have had some shootings over there. And understanding the habitat as well as public education is so very important here in Texas. And tomorrow between 1:30 and 2:30 in the afternoon, I'm going to be signing my little book called My Life with Cranes that was printed by the Crane Foundation about 8 years ago when I turned 70. So I hope to greet many of you tomorrow over there. And I thank you for coming out on this cold night to learn more about cranes.
Anybody got?
Well, we had a whooping crane at the Crane Foundation, lived to be 38 years old. It was hatched at the Crane Foundation. But likely they don't live quite that long in the wild, maybe 20 to 25 years. Yes?
Can you tell us the story about when you were bringing those eggs back on the airplane and they started to hatch?
Yeah, I was bringing 36 crane eggs from Australia to Baraboo in 1984, February. And they were close to the hatching time when I left Sydney, Australia, and by the time I got to Honolulu to go through customs, I had 4 chicks. And the permit said crane eggs. So they put me in a back room and I phoned my friends in Washington and soon I was cleared. And I had seats in the very back of the airplane and 1 seat for the egg box. And I had, just in case that should have happened, I had my socks ready to put a baby crane into my sock with its head sticking out the cut toe because they fight. So I had my 4 little crane chicks in my socks beside the eggs, but I wanted to keep some good air for them. So I would keep the top of the suitcase open so they had enough air. And then people were gathering around me, and I opened the box and they'd all said, "Oh, look at the cranes." And when they'd make a loud sound, the rest of the eggs would speed up their hatching. And it was really quite nerve-wracking. And I got to Los Angeles and I had a few more chicks out. And finally I got to Baraboo and to Madison, and the wind was blowing and I was so tired because I could not sleep. I think it was like, I don't know, 20 hours from the time I left Sydney, Australia. And I passed them all to the Crane Foundation staff. Yeah, it was quite an ordeal. I think that's in my book if you want to read it. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, I have a microphone. It's okay.
Okay.
I have a kind of 2-part question. So they only fly during the day or at night? Do they fly at night as well? They migrate. When they migrate, do they fly during the day only?
Oh, when they migrate. When they migrate, do they fly during the day or during the night? Mostly during the day.
Because I just got involved with the Lights Out, Texas.
Oh, yeah.
The Audubon. Do you work with the Audubon Society at all, or?
Oh, I'm very familiar with the research they were doing in Dallas with the birds flying into the buildings.
Right.
And there's a whole research team up there working on it. We don't have that problem with cranes because they migrate during the day, but it's mainly songbirds that migrate at night and collide with the buildings. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I've had the privilege of visiting the International Crane Foundation in Baraboo, and I remember but it was a while ago. And I remember seeing this amazing story. Now, were you the gentleman who spent months like living in a little hut cottage with a female crane and dancing with her, or was that somebody else? And I apologize. I did not buy your book, but I'm going to, and maybe that story is in there. But were you the one who lived with that like female crane and like single-handedly brought the cranes back from extinction?
Yeah. We produced one egg that hatched. And that was an important bird that lived to be 38 years old.
But that was you who did.
Story about me dancing with the crane in that book. It's too long to tell right now, but I was the person, but I'll tell you a little story connected to that. When we started the Crane Foundation, it was on the property of the co-founder, Ron Sowy's parents. It was a horse farm and they'd moved their horses to Florida. But after 10 years, we bought our permanent site and we were moving our whole operation, but it took us about a decade to make this transition, building from scratch. So we had 2 old office trailers that we used as our office, and you could hear right through the walls. And we didn't have many visitors back then because we were just starting and so on. And one afternoon, this very difficult, challenging lady came in and said, "I want to see the cranes." And Joan Fordham, our administrator, said, "Thank you. It costs $2.50 if you want to go out and look at the cranes." "That's ridiculous." And so they had this argument. She didn't want to pay anything to go out and look at our cranes. But we didn't have much money then, and Joan wasn't going to give up easily. So there was this little argument, went back and forth, and I'm sitting in the next office, really quite amused. Had you heard this story, Rich? Rich is always learning something new from the good old days. Anyway, I am there just smiling and this is going on. And finally the woman pays $2.50. Good, go see the cranes. She's just going out the door and she yells back at Joan, "By the way, is that turkey that danced with the crane still here?" And I was smiling and then I was no longer smiling. I was so shocked. But in hindsight, I should have gone down on my hands and knees and started gobbling my way.
Gobbling.
But I never thought about it until it was too late. So thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you tomorrow.